Hi, this is Aaliyah Swaby, and you're listening to WNHH-LP 103.5 FM, broadcasting live from New Haven, Connecticut, and streaming live at www.newhavenindependent.org.
Hello and welcome to WNHH Radio's Dateline, New Haven. I'm your host, Paul Bass, inviting you to join me on an exploration of what makes the Elm City tick. Hold on to your seats, everyone. The guest in our studio today is about to blast you with a wake-up call about what's happening in our country and in our world while we ignore it at our own peril. His name is Timothy Snyder. He's a professor of history at Yale and a rapidly rising, influential public intellectual and officer. He has a new book out. It's called The Road to Unfreedom, Russia, Europe, America. He's here to tell us just how far along that road you're traveling. And I read this book, and it hasn't gotten out of my mind for now more than a month since I read it. Every day when I read the newspaper or just see news, I'm seeing it now through the filter of what Timothy Snyder writes in this book, and about a fascinating character in history. Sounds a little bit like the name of someone in Russian literature who explains a lot. So Timothy Snyder, welcome back to WHA Studio. You know, you're big time now, and I really appreciate that you make time to come into the Independent. I mean that. I mean, you're on CNN, you're all over the place.
Well, I know, but it's I who really appreciate what you guys do. You're my local radio station, and you guys do investigative journalism, which is what makes people like me, possible. And it's nice what you say about the book, about reading the news through the book, because Road to Unfreedom is meant to be a history book in the sense that it makes sense of the whole story. It's a weird history book because it's about the present, but it's meant to be a history book in that it helps us to make sense of all the little pieces which otherwise so easily just float around.
Yeah. It's so, it's the best kind of history because it's a fascinating new look of understanding the last 100 years, because your specialty has always been the mass murders, the genocides of left and right wing, if those are even relevant terms, regimes from Germany to former Soviet Union over the last 100 years. And you've documented that in previous books that are prize winning and authoritative. And you've put it in such a modern context here. But let's get to that, let's get to that gradually. What, Timothy Snyder, is the road to unfreedom?
Yeah, I mean, I'm starting from the feeling that I think a lot of us have, that what's happening to our republic is not just threatening, but also strange, uncanny.
It's strange.
It's not just unusual that we're in the situation that we're in. There's something deeply and profoundly weird about it. It's like we're on a boat and we can never get our sea legs. It's, the news that comes in is unexpected, but it's also somehow disheartening and confusing. And I think the reason for that is that we're shifting from one idea of time to another. And this is something that I try to bring, as a historian, the idea that time itself is not something you take for granted. Time itself can change. So I start the book with the notion of the politics of inevitability, which means progress, which means the idea that we know the rules of history. So maybe if you're on the right, you think that the market's going to bring democracy, or if you're on the left, you think that the arc of history is long, but it bends towards justice. But you've got some idea of how things are basically going in the right way. And then at some point you get hit. Maybe you get hit in 2008 when you can't afford a house. You get hit in 2016 when an unexpected person gets elected. But you get hit and you shudder, you're shocked, you're shaken. and you shift towards something which I call the politics of eternity, where you just forget about the future. You look to the past. You start thinking about making America great again. You start thinking that the reason why things didn't always work out was not, not me, but them. It was the other people, the immigrants, the aliens, the blacks, the Jews, whatever it might be, the Muslims.
Gays.
Yeah, the gays. You start thinking instead of about a future where things get better, you start thinking about a past where you imagine things were better, and the future gets locked out of your brain. And that's a way to govern. And the way it's done in the 21st century is you loop back to the middle of the 20th century in a kind of nostalgic haze, and you pound people with the daily news cycle so they can't really think about the future. The road to freedom is inevitability to eternity, progress to doom. And the idea of the book is that if we grasp history, if we see where we really are, we can exit that road and we can start, if we figure out where we are, we can start making things better.
Well, it's interesting. I guess this is getting a little ethereal here, but one thing that interested me a lot that affected my thinking when I read this book, okay, you set out these two ways of looking at how events unfold. And it's interesting you said left and right both have their versions of the politics of inevitability that the world eventually gets better, which is something I do believe. I always believe it's 2 steps forward, 1 step back, and that's just a religious belief. It's not grounded in history, right?
Yeah.
So you showed us that everyone had this idea after the Soviet Union fell of the politics of inevitability, and that what we've seen, not just in the United States, what we've seen in the last couple of years is authoritarian governments are on the rise throughout the West, former Eastern Europe, Soviet Union. I mean, all over the world, including in our country, people are getting elected even democratically who want to get rid of our constitutional protections, the right to free speech, the authoritarian strongman leaders who are relying on propaganda and going to people's historical grievances and prejudice to rule. But what was interesting to me is that you didn't hold up as the smart people, the inevitability people. You didn't hold the free market Western people who advocate the kind of system we'd like to hold up as being smart. You said they're just as blind to how history works and what's happening right now, that it wasn't true that once the Soviet Union fell, market-based economies were always going to prevail because people were going to see how much greater it is. There are people who are upset about globalization. It became putty for people like Viktor Orban in Hungary or in Turkey or Poland. And you're kind of saying there's a lot at stake here.
Yeah, I mean, the first thing I want to do is affirm the premise of the question. It's really important to see that the problem with democracy, the rule of law in this country, is part of a worldwide trend.
Yeah.
Because we go back or we go forward together. What happens in the U.S. in our presidential elections makes it easier for people in Poland and Hungary, or for that matter, Burma or the Philippines to do things that they want to do. It's all
even
one
Israel.
story.
Look at how Netanyahu and Israel has been. And it's all a matter of degree. They still have a democracy, so how much can you do within that democracy?
Yeah,
but they have if you look at the alliances Netanyahu has these days, it's all with authoritarian regimes, including Vladimir Putin, who recognize a kindred soul.
Yeah, I mean, that's the other thing which is worth pointing out, is in the 21st century, when you lose democracy, it's by way of what the political scientists call backsliding. And you keep having elections, but each election maybe matters less than the one before it. Nobody has any great ideas about what to have besides democracy. So you keep having elections, but at some point they cease to matter.
And it's not really left-right. I mean, look at Colombia, left-wing. Venezuela, had its election this weekend. Maduro, that was the same trend toward the authoritarian.
Yeah. But I mean, the big point that you're making, and that I want to just spell out a little bit, is about 1989, about the end of communism. So communism is also a politics of inevitability. Right? I mean, the Marxism in the Leninist version is also politics of inevitability. We know the way history is going to be. We're scientists of history. Class struggle is going to lead to revolution, is going to lead to a certain kind of society. History is going to end. That version of the politics of inevitability dies, at least in Europe and America, more or less dies in 1989. The problem is that many of us in 1989 say their story's wrong, and therefore ours is right.
Yeah.
But ours is just another version of the politics of inevitability. If you think the market has to bring about, the market will bring about good institutions and democracy and justice, and you don't have to do anything, that's also the politics of inevitability. So we fell into a trap. And I think that, the trap, the quicksand of there's no more history, or there are no alternatives.
Right. Fukuyama said we went from the left and the right, whether it was Jeffrey Sachs believing that without civic institutions you can bring great democracy to the Soviet Union.
Yeah, this is a great point. It's not actually about left and right here. It's it's a little bit about American exceptionalism, that we were the ones who figured out these rules. And then it's a lot about
the EU.
It's a lot about human laziness and about the difficulty of actually paying attention to history. Because what history teaches is that there are always alternatives. And what history teaches is that history never ends.
And we're talking to Timothy Snyder, who has a new book, Road to Unfreedom, Russia, Europe, America. It is a blockbuster. It's a masterpiece, and he's telling us about how all over the world now we are sliding into an authoritarian nightmare. And he makes the case, because Timothy Snyder is one of the most revered historians about what happened in the 20th century with the gulags and with Nazism, and he sees a rerun of sorts in the making, if that's fair, though overly simplistic. You tell a story in this book that builds on your previous work, but it's a different story. And the most interesting character in your book, in my opinion, is a guy named Ivan Ilyin. Who was Ivan Ilyin, and what do we need to know about him?
So there's a general way all around the world, and it's part of this authoritarian trend that you mentioned. There's a general trend of going back to the 1930s and 1940s and picking up thinkers. Steve Bannon does that in this country. Mr. Trump's reference to America First is the same thing. Britain, France, Poland, Hungary, all in different ways are referring to the 30s and 40s in a positive light, which is interesting because insofar as there used to be a lesson about the 20th century, it was that the 30s and 40s were not a good time. As in so many other things, the Russians are ahead of everybody else, and they're more precise. They have a specific set of thinkers that they have pulled up from the fascist period of the 20s, 30s, and 40s, and the most important of them is this fellow Ivan Ilyin.
Ilyin said his name wrong. Ivan Ilyin.
Ivan Ilyin, yeah. And so how can you prove a thinker's important? You know, we think ideas don't matter. That's part of our politics of inevitability. There aren't really any ideas anymore. There are no alternatives. But there are. You know, if the president of Russia reinterrs the corpse of a forgotten fascist thinker, if the president of Russia cites him in all of his important speeches, we should probably pay attention to that. And that's where I start the book. What Ilyin says are three useful things.
First of all, he was a guy who was sent to the Gulag by the Communist Party when they took over. He was considered anti-Soviet, right? But he then decided he revered the Nazis, correct? And how they took power, which actually Joseph Stalin did too. And then he came back later in life, and he was a supporter of both the Orthodox Church and the Communist Party. Do I remember that wrong?
Okay, so he left he left Bolshevik Russia in 1922. He was forced to leave. He was forced into political immigration. In political immigration, he became an admirer first of Mussolini and then of Hitler. His core idea was that fascism was part of a deeper and broader movement which Russia would eventually lead. And that was because, in his view, the whole world is spoiled except for Russia. Russia will lead some kind of future fascist regeneration. That regeneration will involve totalitarianism in Russia, and that totalitarianism will mean, among other things, ritualized elections and a lack of social advancement, because all the Russians will be cells in a national body, and freedom will mean knowing your place. What's interesting is how these ideas, these fascist ideas of the first part of the 20th century, are now being revived in a 21st century context.
But at the end of his life, wasn't there a revival of him at some point?
He died in total obscurity. He was revived in the 90s, 45 years after his death, when the Soviet Union falls apart. No, he's interesting because he's a very prolific thinker, an important thinker in certain ways, but he died in total obscurity.
But he had a theory about Kiev, right? Wasn't that his theory that's been built on to be the now sort of seminal story about what Vladimir Putin is and what he's trying to do?
I mean, Mr. Putin is another, in this book, I try to pay a lot of attention to what Mr. Putin actually says. And the book, the front end of the book is about Russia. Because, you know, we as Americans have to sometimes refresh ourselves and remind ourselves that there are other countries, and sometimes other countries matter more than we do, or sometimes they show us where we're going. Sometimes they push us around, as happened in 2016. But in the case of Mr. Putin, before he comes back to office as president in 2011 and early 2012, he writes a series of articles about how Russia is not so much a state as a civilization. In other words,
going from sea to sea.
Sorry?
Going from sea to sea.
Yeah. Laws don't matter so much. Borders in the traditional sense don't matter. What matters is the past, or rather his view of the past. And in Mr. Putin's view of the past, which he borrows from Ilyin, Russia and Ukraine are together as one civilization and as one culture. And thinking in that way, it's not so hard to get to the idea that we have to invade Ukraine, which comes a couple of years later.
And then there's this guy named Vladimir in the early 20th century. Kiev, there isn't even a Ukraine yet, right? Kiev is part of a territory that's not a part of Ukraine, right? And what year are we talking about now when this Vladimir makes a short-term alliance with an invading army and converts to Christianity?
Okay, we're talking about 1,000 years ago, and this is a great example of the politics of eternity, because the way the politics of eternity works, it's not history, right? Like the politics of inevitability, the progress, the politics of eternity, the doom, these are both taken up by intellectuals who sort of pose as if they understand how the past becomes the future. But really, these are just kind of pretty shallow ideologies. What the politics of eternity does, it says, we can pull from anywhere in the past that suits us. We'll just say there's a big loop going back to the past. The past is like a cycle. So in the case of Vladimir Putin, he and his acolytes, his supporters, talk about Vladimir, in the 21st century is somehow the same person as this Viking, basically, this Scandinavian slave trading warlord who was quite possibly a Muslim before he became a pagan again and then before he became a Christian. A very complicated figure who more than 1,000 years ago converted to Christianity for basically political reasons.
To get a neighboring warlord's group to fight with him, right, to take territory.
Yeah. I mean, it was about establishing a political claim over a trading post in Kiev, and this is how the Russians begin their history. But it doesn't. I mean, it doesn't. There is really no direct connection. But if you are Vladimir Putin and you say, I invoke, the innocent Christian past which begins in Kiev because it's all part of one civilization, then suddenly the existence of the Ukrainian state and the existence of the Russian state, for that matter, fade away.
So this story, they commemorated, didn't they, the anniversary of that Vladimir's conversion. They've elevated even Ilyin, am I saying right, as a thinker, like where they have a whole committee that advises Putin that's based on his followers. And in the Russian imagination, they talk about this incident you're talking about as an important moment in the history when they justify invading Ukraine. I thought I got that.
Oh,
from the
yeah.
book.
No, you're absolutely right.
That's what's so
right.
interesting to me. They created a founding story where Vladimir Putin is sort of a descendant or reincarnation of that. But the other thing they did in doing that is they brought together, according to Timothy Snyder, the Orthodox Church in Russia. There's now this alliance between the Orthodox Church and really what's the new version of the Communist Party, which is Putin's rule. Sworn enemies under Soviet Union. They had to find a way to fuse those two entities to have an alliance now to perpetuate Putin's rule. Is that not correct? And that's how they get this Vladimir character who for 5 minutes was Christian. They make his Christianity central to the story.
Well, what you need is a story about eternity, a story where Russia is always innocent, and if anybody doesn't understand Russian history and Russian virtue, they attack Russia. So the coalition you're talking about between the Orthodox Church, the security services, and basically the chief oligarchical clan, which is Mr. Putin's oligarchical clan, that is not a coalition which is going to create policy, right? That's not a coalition which can offer much of a future. On the contrary, with that coalition, you're going to have an awful lot of nostalgia, and you're going to have no rule of law, and hence no promise that anybody could ever do better. So in that situation, you don't want to talk about the future. What you want to talk about is the past. You don't want to talk about domestic policy. You want to talk about foreign policy, and by foreign policy, you mean the tendency of everybody, the Europeans, the Americans, to constantly assault Russia.
So when they invade Crimea, this in 2014, this story, his theory, Ilyin's theory and centrality of Ukraine to the Russian story gets made very public. Every time something like this comes up, the Russian media puts out stories through a worldwide network. It picks up that the gay, black, Jewish West is intervening, and they're the enemy. I see that over and over in the stories you're doing. And the night wolves, you have these sort of like thuggish right-wing groups working on behalf of the Russian government come in and cause trouble, and they hack the elections to try to interfere with the vote there. It seemed to me that 2014 Crimea invasion in your book emerges as a prototype for what we're seeing happen around the world, that when these events take place, Russia then uses a sophisticated media strategy to promote this idea.
Yeah, it was in 2013, 2014 that I started writing this book, and it was actually done before Trump won. I added a chapter at the end about Trump in 2016, 17, but the book was done because it was then, 4 years ago, that I understood what was going on, which was that the information war was more important than the real war. Russia had a lot of trouble in the real war in Ukraine, but the information war they won completely. They cleared out 6, 9, 12 months where we were confused. We were fighting with each other. We couldn't see what was happening.
I remember being confused. I remember saying, oh, maybe this is like They had both Jews like me thinking, well, they were getting rid of the anti-Semites in Ukraine, and they had the anti-Semites thinking this is Russia battling against the like sort of Jewish conspiracy.
So that's one of the that is exactly that's 2016. You know that what you just said, because in 2014, what they did was they aimed their internet propaganda at susceptible groups. So if you were an anti-Semite, you were told that Ukraine was a Jewish construct. But if you were a left-wing Jew, you were told that the Ukrainians were all fascists and Nazis.
And we're ready to believe
and
that.
And in the interesting, well, you know.
I remember being at a minion at Yale with some guy from Ukraine, and we were saying, yeah, we don't know where to stand on this one because we hate intervention in the Soviet era, but we also know what Ukrainians did to Jews.
Yeah. And so they play, I mean, that's exactly it. They play on your vulnerabilities, right? So you've got reason to worry about that. You have a really good human historical reason to worry, and they start with that, and then they just play it, and they push you with it. And that's why that's important is that, you know, in 2016, by 2016, thanks to better techniques, they know even more about how Americans are susceptible. And so they do the same thing.
Right. You have certain messages sent out to Black Lives Matter, people that protest and drop out, and Jill Stein, and then the people who hate those people, the racists. Yeah,
so you push, I mean, people who are anti-racist, you push them in one way. People who are racist, you push them in a different way. And it doesn't matter that your message contradicts because your message is targeted.
Confusion
And the
helps.
people that you're targeting don't talk to each other anyway.
Well, two parts of investigative historical research I thought you did. One of them was that you went back and it appears that you watched a lot of Russian TV and read a lot of what was the internet in Russian. And you describe these incredible scenes to me of official events where they have like projected pictures of Barack Obama as like an ape doing sexual weird things, like building on this whole anti-black thing. You have all these like weird events, like these ritualized dramas put on by the Night Wolves and other kind of paramilitary groups, feeding into the story of the virile Russia being attacked by the gay, Jewish, black West and taking that stand. And it was bizarre stuff.
Well, it's bizarre if you're not used to it. I mean, the danger is that when you spend a lot of time with it, you start to think,
you must have been going nuts watching this stuff.
Well, I mean,
like, were you in a room just at 3 a.m, like not being able to turn it off because this is so fascinating, thinking, I'm watching something explosive that the whole world doesn't even know is going on.
I'll tell you what, it's an advantage, right? I mean, I think in this moment in the U.S., we all have to bring what we have. And one of the things I have is that I know a little bit about how information technology works in Eastern Europe. And so when I'm watching this stuff, yeah, I mean, it's a little bit weird and you take a break, but what I'm doing is I'm noticing techniques, and those techniques will then show up later in the United States. So it's an advantage. And what you're describing, of course, you know, the things you mentioned, that when Russia invades Ukraine, it sends this, you know, gay bashing biker gang to celebrate. When it's Barack Obama's birthday, students in Moscow project onto the wall of the American embassy an image of him filleting a banana. You know, these kinds of things are just extreme forms of us-them politics. They're ways of saying, you know, we are better because we are the civilization, where civilization means, you know, heterosexual, white, male. It's an extreme version of something which many people in this country also find attractive. Right.
And in the meantime, for years, according to your book and other stuff I've read, Putin's people were developing alliances and bringing to Russia people like Richard Spencer, the Nazi leader in America, people like Donald Trump and his organization, people like Viktor Orban, the originally pro-democratic but now authoritarian leader in Hungary, and that they were building this network of anti-democrats, authoritarian type future leaders with these common narratives of the conservative West. And then we find they were able to get leading conservative outlets, what used to be called conservative, like Breitbart, like Fox News, to repeat these tropes. And the reason I was thinking about that, so I was just reading an article in the Weekly Standard, which I actually think has become an essential, terrific magazine, this conservative magazine, even though I'm not conservative. I've always loved that magazine. They've stepped it up since the election of Trump because they believe there's an assault on truth. They have a story about how they trace the birth of a counter-narrative, how Russia, when they were complicit with Syria in the use of chemical weapons, and I'm going to say the town wrong, Duma, did I say it right? That they originally put out a story, just like they said in your book, to confuse everybody about whether there actually were chemical weapons used when it was obvious it was. And then when Russia and Syria prevented inspectors from going in while they tried to destroy the evidence. They put out all these stories to their own media networks. And then they got those American networks that everybody parrots here on the right, like Fox News, to pick it up. So the Weekly Standard reports how Tucker Carlson, primetime top audience getter at Fox News, days after they put out these fictions about how there are no chemical weapons and it's all a hoax, he aggressively promotes that line on Fox News prime time and keeps this lie alive. And what's interesting is the Weekly Standard is where Tucker Carlson was made a name for himself before he went on to Fox News, and they're so upset about what so-called conservatives have done that they trace that line.
Yeah. No, there's some great stuff going on in that question. The first thing that I would stress is that there is such a thing as conservatism, which means concern for the facts. I mean, that's you can go all the way back to Edmund Burke, but the idea that the world is constructed of specific concrete realities that we can describe in language is a core conservative idea, and it's refreshing to see when there are still American conservatives who are following that up. And I mean, and I learned from them, and I'm impressed. Second thing is, it's hugely important that we have factuality, because of, I mean, just the basic point. But if we don't have factuality, if we just have the stuff that people tell us, then we don't know where it comes from, right? Part of factuality is knowing where the chains of lies begin, and the fact that they begin in Russia is really telling. An example that you give, which is from the present, can be multiplied, right? I mean, the bot swarm around the so-called Devin Nunes memo earlier this year was Russian, or largely Russian.
Or like when the tape came out in the 2016 election campaign about the famous Billy Bush tape of
Access
Trump
Hollywood.
that was going to kill his campaign within a half hour.
Yeah.
There was a release of Russian-connected
And that was-
WikiLeaks about making the Democrats look bad.
It's a beautiful Russian technique, which you've already mentioned, which is cacophony. So something happens in the real world that you don't like and can't control, so you swarm it with fictions. That's what the Russians did in Ukraine when they shot down MH17, the civilian airliner. They surrounded it with 5 or 6 fictions so that their people didn't know what happened, but they assumed it wasn't their fault, which is what people will always assume if you tell them that it's something else. The same thing happens with Access Hollywood. You know, there was half an hour where we, Trump, Pence, everybody thought that the president's open advocacy of sexual predation
President's campaign
might hurt.
We all thought
But
it was
it doesn't hurt, because the Russians and their bots helped us surround it with a whole bunch of fictions, where Hillary Clinton and John Podesta supposedly do worse things. And so it then doesn't matter, right? It then doesn't matter. That's not, and it was a Russian technique, but it was also direct Russian action. I mean, they bailed him out at that moment, as they did at a bunch of other moments.
The Road to Unfreedom by Timothy Snyder, new book, a must-read about the authoritarian slide of our world. Timothy, can I ask you to read an excerpt? Because you've established in your book the bulk of it, really looking largely at Russia, but not only Russia, the development of this new technique of sowing chaos and eliminating fact and freedoms that Russia's undergone. But they've done it with patrons. I mean, they've been the patron for people like Donald Trump. I was wondering if I can give you, where I've marked off a section from 269 to 270 in your book. I've marked it, if you don't mind reading it. And it's partly about this idea of cuck-servative, this kind of macho put down of a conservative who isn't joining this populist assault on fact and gays and blacks that Trump and Russia are promoting. Here's Timothy Snyder reading from The Road to Unfreedom.
Like his Russian patrons, Trump portrayed the presidency of Barack Obama as an aberration. Along with RT, Trump promoted the fiction that Obama was not an American, an idea meant to strengthen the notion that, quote unquote, the people are whites. Like Putin with his monkey imitation, like Ilyin and his obsession with jazz as white emasculation, like Prohanov with his nightmares of black milk and black sperm, Trump dwelled in fantasies of black power. When Trump won the presidency, Kisilov exulted that Obama was, quote, now like a eunuch who cannot do anything, unquote. Trump was the only presidential candidate in American history to brag about his penis. His white supremacist supporters called Republicans who would not support Trump's racism cuck-servatives. The reference was to the pornographic meme of a white husband cuckold to a white wife who watches her perform fellatio on a black man. To sexualize the enemy was to make politics into biological conflict, and to trade the hard work of reform and freedom for endless, anxious preening. In an American eternity, the enemy is black, and politics begins by saying so. Thus, the next point of innocence in Trump's politics of eternity, after the 1930s era racist isolationism of America First, was an alternative 1860s in which the Civil War was never fought. In actual American history, African Americans were enfranchised a few years after the American Civil War of 1861 to 1865. If blacks are to be excluded from the people, an American politics of eternity has to keep them in bondage. And thus, just as the Trump administration questioned the wisdom of fighting Hitler, it also questioned the wisdom of fighting slavery. Speaking of the Civil War, Trump asked, "Why could that one not have been worked out?" His chief of staff, John Kelly, claimed that the cause of the Civil War was the absence of compromise, suggesting that if people had been more reasonable, the United States might have reasonably remained a country where black people were reasonably enslaved. In the minds of some of Trump's supporters, the approval of the Holocaust and the endorsement of slavery were intertwined. In a major extreme right demonstration in Charlottesville, Virginia, Nazi and Confederate symbols appeared together.
That's Timothy Snyder reading from The Road to Unfreedom, a book that I haven't stopped thinking about since I read it. I think you won't either. It's a new book. Now, Timothy Snyder, you strike me as somebody who, even though you're enjoying a moment that a lot of academics don't get, you're enjoying a moment where even though you've spent endless hours through source materials in a number of countries and number of languages to write historical record, you're actually being listened to by millions of people who watch CNN, who read the New York Times, who go on Facebook and read your posts. You are an oracle right now. You are saying that we're living in dangerous times. We're forgetting history. We got to pay attention to history to watch what's happening now. This threat of a rise of something that reminds us of fascism. How do you see that role being intellectual when you're a historian? Your role is to the truth. Normally, academics aren't seen as playing this kind of role. How has that transition been for you in the last 2 years?
Well, first of all, I have this general.
I mean, you get stopped by strangers in New York who recognize you from your Facebook posts about how we got to buy our tickets to Canada in case the fascists come in. That kind of stuff.
Yeah, I mean, I get stopped by women on the subway who show me copies of On Tyranny in their purse. And that's nice. I mean,
and that was the book you wrote. That's the opposite of this book in your previous books. That was like a pamphlet, like Tom Paine's Common Sense, that told you what to do to prepare for this new era.
But the two are related because I'd finished Road to Unfreedom, and then Trump won. So then I wrote On Tyranny and started doing the civic stuff. And then doing the civic stuff, I learned something about the U.S., partly from American activists, right? And that helped me write the last chapter to Road to Unfreedom. But I mean, I just have this basic idea that we should bring what we have, and what I have is history. And I think the role of being an intellectual and the role of being a historian are a little bit different. You emphasize different things. You might make broader claims. But I also think that history, I really sincerely think that history is political thought. That if you have history itself, it keeps you away from the temptations of inevitability on one side and eternity on the other side. And I sincerely think that history is a precondition for civic engagement because you have to know where you are to know what you can do. And I also really sincerely think that history is a precondition for questions of what's good and what's not, what's good and what's
it's
evil.
harder than ever to have history enter the conversation because we're all dealing with media that yells at you with your phone or on cable TV. Every 5 minutes, there's a new headline that's geared toward getting you upset and worried without historical context. Like what always got me is when people said George Bush was the worst president ever. Then Barack Obama was the worst president ever. Said by people, I never said it, but if I were one of those people, I don't know 9/10 of the president's records well enough to judge that and have any kind of sense of history, let alone how we can see the events of today in the context of the 1930s and 40s.
Yeah, I mean, if all you're thinking about is yourself in the present moment and you're making extreme judgments like that, then you've already been played. Because the moment, if you're only living in that moment, there's somebody else who's not living in that moment who's playing you. So, and part of getting into authoritarianism is precisely getting overwhelmed by the bad news or getting overwhelmed by the good news, if you like what's happening, and forgetting about what you need and what you've lost or what you might lose.
Harry Jost points out here that Fox News is not the only conservative media voice. That is ridiculous. There's the Daily Caller, which is even much more fictional, and Breitbart, and that the mainstream media ran with plenty of the false stories, which is also true. Like when the Russians succeeded to get people, when it looked like Trump's campaign was done with the sex tape, they got them to talk instead about the WikiLeaks, which the New York Times kind of regrets that. You know, they had a mea culpa for how they felt they were manipulated too. That the success goes in a lot more corners.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, the what I would stress is that, you know, in terms of American media and the truth, what we need are investigative journalists, whether they're working for BuzzFeed or whether they're working for the Wall Street Journal. In some sense, I don't care, so long as we have investigative journalists. Where everything starts to go wrong, I think, is in 2008, 2009, when with the financial crisis, we lose local reporting like this. I mean, about 70 people are fired on average in American newsrooms every day in 2009.
See, I'm a lot less worried about that than you are, Tim. Yeah, I agree with you how ultra important it is, because that's what I dedicate my life to.
Yeah.
Although I want to call it just investigative. I would say investigative journalism has to inform how you do everything, including that day's announcement by the mayor, remembering what happened 5 years ago, asking for a single document.
Yeah.
I think we're in a golden age of journalism, but we are up against this fake news, because even though we're losing all those jobs, that was corporate-owned media where people kind of all said the same thing and chased the same story. Yeah. And I think the internet has given birth to so many new kinds of journalism, and so many more people are reading. And it was partly helped by Trump, but more people than ever, like twice, 3 times more people than ever, are reading the New York Times and the Washington Post stories. And on the local level, I've seen hundreds of experiments like ours take root. They don't always last.
I'm glad, but I mean, good. I hope you're right and I'm wrong. But as a general point, I think it's like, as much as I am every day talking about factuality and investigative
reporters,
in
danger because of the ability to it's other forces to.
I think the thing that we have to think about is that renaissance you're talking about, like how to really make that happen.
Yes, because
you can't just play defense on factuality. I mean, as you know very well, because you do it every day, you have to create the facts. You have to go out there and find them
and be credible
and report them and do it every day.
So historically, more people did read the National Enquirer, making up stories this mark, than they did the New York Times. Now, 3 times, 4 times many people reading the New York Times, and 20 times many people are reading the equivalent of the National Enquirer on sites like Breitbart or on Facebook now. And I think the fight is just to keep doing good factual journalism.
Of course.
And then make it credible.
Yeah, absolutely. I completely agree with that.
So now you've been getting great reviews for your new book, The Road to Unfreedom. And I noticed there was a historian who reviewed the book at the New York Times Book Review the other week, said great book, and gently had a critique. I think, was it a she?
It was a she, yeah.
Said that, and this is her subject. She knows how strong you are. You're sort of the authority on the 20th century genocides and how they fit today. She said you didn't always prove cause and effect. That just because the stuff was all over Facebook, does that mean that got people? There's no doubt that Russia is planting these fake stories and really understanding American politics better than certainly Hillary Clinton did when they knew how to plant stories on Facebook. How do we show that this actually affected the outcome of the election?
Yeah,
and that people are acting on it?
A couple things here. I mean, the first is that part of cause and effect is necessary conditions, and a necessary condition for Trump being elected president of the United States is his existence as a public figure. Without the Russians, Trump does not exist as a public figure.
Right, and since you wrote this book, there's actually been a cascade of evidence about that coming out with the reporting of ProPublica and the Washington Post, that it looks like there were billions of dollars of dirty money by the Russian mafia that connected to Putin that was laundered through overpaying for Trump real estate around the world and supposed joint projects where they put all the money, and they created him as a successful businessman. That part I got.
Yeah. So
the question is, the preconditions are there.
So I mean, in a world where Russia is not doing the things you're talking about, which I talk about in Root to Unfreedom, a lot of that was already reported by Americans and Russians in 2016. In a world without Russian intervention, Trump does not exist and therefore was not president of the U.S. Okay. The second thing, another way to think about it is that they chose him. So long before you and I were thinking about him as a presidential candidate, long before the Republican Party was thinking about as a presidential candidate, the Russians were. And that's why I was the first person to write about Putin and Trump, because I was following it from the Russian point of view, not the American one. He was clearly their guy, right? So they chose him. Now, then there's the third question of, did they actually make a difference, right? I mean, already it's a lot to have created him and chosen him.
Right. For instance,
But-
we know they tried to hack into voting results. I think it was Ohio. They didn't succeed. We know
Yeah.
in Crimea they hacked the results and reported them on Russian TV,
Right.
but then they caught it afterwards. And we know they're trying to
Yeah.
do this. Do we know
But
if
I
it
mean,
worked?
okay, but on like, did they make a difference? It was awfully close. Facebook brought down 60 million fake sites. Twitter, once they started looking, brought down 1 million fake sites a day. Fake news on Facebook, as you know, was more widely read than real news in the 6 weeks before the election. We already talked about Access Hollywood, which should have brought him down, but didn't. And also think about the whole atmosphere of the Democratic campaign. The fact that the Russians leaked things like the phone numbers of Democratic Party activists and Democratic Party donors meant that the whole Democratic Party was in a different and much more anxious atmosphere than the Republicans were in 2016. So did they make enough of a difference to pick up that, 1% or whatever? Yeah, I think they certainly did. If anything, I would say we underestimate how important Twitter and Facebook were in 2016. I think we overestimate how important the traditional stuff was. And here's a reason to think that. Pretty much everybody relying on the traditional stuff said Trump's definitely going to lose. But it was the people who were Russia experts who were saying, what about the bots, who predicted that Trump would win. And they were right. So that's worth thinking about.
Right. And I had a different question, which is not at all a critique of your work, but growing out of your work that I've been wrestling for a while, Timothy Snyder. What happens when people democratically don't want democracy? What happens when people, and we all know there's a separate question about democracy that's very important, that you can't just have a vote and call that democracy. You need independent civic institutions that enable democracy to thrive, such as a free press that keeps people honest, such as think tanks and third sector charities that can independently bring about change and question authority. But what happens when people genuinely in Muslim majority countries want to have not necessarily a caliphate, but what if they want to vote in anti-democratic people who are more in favor of Muslim law? What happens when what's happening and breaking my heart in Israel when the politics is shifting toward a settler right-wing Orthodox movement that actually wants that to be the country? What happens when in the former Soviet countries in Eastern Europe, like Hungary and Poland, people genuinely respond to revive anti-Semitism, nurture those historic wounds to the politics of eternity? What happens when people vote out democracy? What if that's what they want?
Well,
It's a bleak view of human nature, I know.
No, I mean, I think it's not as simple as it might seem. I mean, that's a kind of way of like, I think that makes it too easy, because most people most of the time are the way that you describe. If you took Americans in 2018 and like you took the Constitution away and you had them all set up a system, would they come up with the Constitution? Of course they wouldn't, right? I mean, the whole point of any kind of social contract like our Constitution is that we know that we're not so great, right? The founders knew we weren't so great. Like, we know the founders weren't so great, but they also know that we're not so great, right? They look into the future and say Americans aren't going to be so great, hence we have to have all these constraints, right? So democracy,
protect the rights of minorities,
yeah, I mean,
rule of law
you have to
over
have checks and
people.
balances, and the rule of law is the fundamental one, right? I mean, what we're really talking about is not so much democracy, but the rule of law. Democracy is an element of the rule of law, and it's a way of keeping rule of law states going. It's not a thing in itself. But I mean, another fundamental point about your question is that democracy, and this goes back to your very first question about the politics of inevitability, democracy, of course, doesn't go on by itself. People have to care about it. People have to realize, oh, democracy is what makes the United States exist. Or they have to think, if we had more of a democracy in this country, we would actually get policy outcomes that matter to us. I think the stakes in the U.S. right now are something like that. An awful lot of people don't think that the government can do anything. And therefore, why does democracy matter, right? In order to have democracy, you have to remind people, and this is what at the end of the book I call the politics of responsibility. If you do have democracy, we actually could make policies that would make our children's lives and our lives a lot better, right? But you have to make that argument. You have to win that argument, or else, there's no reason to think democracy is going to go on by itself.
Right. You have to fight
It's a
for it every
cycle.
day, and you have to fight for facts.
Yeah.
And another thing I kept thinking about when I read your book was what I've been reading about the huge advances in video technology. And it's really going to be by the next presidential election that everybody will be able to create videos that look like they really happened. So it'll look like Hillary Clinton was in the pizzeria and ran a sex ring there. I mean, you'll be able to make videos like that. You'll be able to have people look like they said horrible things. It'll look, it'll change the historical record. How we can deal with that?
Well, I mean, first of all, we have to have a fundamental rethink about what the public space is. So, you and I are actually together having this conversation. It's not a cartoon of you and it's not a stick drawing of me. We're actually here in some kind of a space in an actual city. That's what, from the Greeks to the Swiss to the founding fathers to whatever, people who are thinking about democracy are imagining a three-dimensional space. If we're going to spend 10 hours and 38 minutes a day staring at screens, which, by the way, hide all you on Facebook, if we're going to do that, we have to then think about that as a public space and say, look, we have to have some conventions or some rules here. I think we're making a big mistake when we think, like, if we follow the Twitter or the Facebook line that the truth always comes to the top. No, that's not what happens. You have to have some kind of convention about how the space is going to work. I mean, think of the internet as a public space and then have some rules about it. We're really slow on that, right? The second thing is, I think the way it will only work if we actually privilege being in the real world. So I can imagine an upside of what you just said, which is that people actually go and listen to their candidates personally, right? Or people read what they write because that's harder to fake, at least if you have trusted outlets, right? You can think of, okay, well, there's a three-dimensional world which actually has an authentic advantage over the video world because it's harder to fake the three-dimensional world than the screen world. So maybe we should spend less time on it. But of course, fundamentally, all that stuff is a matter of education. If we teach our kids that the screens are what's real, that's what they're going to think, right?
So, Timothy Snyder, do you mind if I read an excerpt from your book?
Please.
Because you're talking about the politics of responsibility as an alternative to the politics of inevitability, the politics of fraternity. If we want freedom, if we want democracy, rule of law, we have to fight for it every day. So at the end of your book, you say it's important that after you've depressed the hell out of us, you said we can fight back, embrace fact, promote equality, democracy, and freedom. Quote, if we see history as it is, we see our places in it, what we might change, and how we might do better. We halt our thoughtless journey from inevitability to eternity and exit the road to unfreedom. We begin a politics of responsibility. Students of the virtues that history reveals, we become the makers of a renewal that no one can foresee. Timothy Snyder, after bringing me down to the depths, you gave me hope. Good. Thank you for writing your new book, which I recommend everyone go out and read this minute, called The Road to Unfreedom. Russia, Europe, and America, you will not be able to put it down or tell your spouse what's in it every 10 minutes. And Timothy Snyder, thank you for joining us on Dateline New Haven and WNHH-FM.
So glad to be with you.
We're going to take it out with the Afro-Semitic Experience performing I Wish I Knew How It Would Feel to Be Free from the group CD, A Plea for Peace. Now, we know what it's like to be free. We just got to remember to book our flight and fight for it. Book your flight for us with us all day and all night long here at WNHH, New Haven's home for community radio.